The evening air was crisp, the hum of city traffic filling the streets as pedestrians moved along the sidewalks. David Callaway, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, adjusted his jacket as he stepped out of a cafe. He had just finished a meeting and was heading toward his car when the flashing red and blue lights painted the buildings around him. "Hands where I can see them." David froze as 4 uniformed officers approached with their hands on their holstered weapons. The tension in the air was thick. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't move," one officer barked. "You match the description of a suspect with an active warrant." David's brows furrowed. "What suspect? What warrant?" The lead officer, a young cop with a hardened expression, ignored the question. "Turn around, hands behind your back. Now." David clenched his jaw. He knew the legal protocol. They hadn't even asked for identification or stated probable cause. He could see it in their eyes. They were relying on assumptions, not facts. "Officer," David began, his voice level, "you're making a mistake." The officer didn't listen. Within seconds, cold steel cuffs clamped around his wrists. Then, a senior officer, one who had been quiet until now, finally stepped forward, studying David's face. His eyes widened. "Wait a second," he muttered. He reached into David's jacket pocket, pulling out a federal badge. His face drained of color. "Sir," he swallowed hard. "We just arrested a federal agent." Silence fell. David inhaled deeply, locking eyes with the stunned officers. "This," he said, his voice deadly calm, "is going to be a big problem for you." David Callaway's jaw tightened as he stared at the officers who had just slapped cuffs on a federal agent without a shred of reasonable suspicion. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. The lead officer, still gripping his arm, scoffed. "Look, man, we're just doing our jobs. You match the description." David exhaled sharply. "Oh, really? What description would that be?" The officer hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. David continued, his voice controlled but sharp. "Let me guess. Black male, tall, wearing a jacket? That's it, isn't it?" The silence spoke volumes. The senior officer, the one who had just realized who they had in custody, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "If we're wrong, then we're wrong," he muttered, as if that was a sufficient excuse. David's eyes narrowed. "Wrong? That's it?" He let out a cold laugh. "You detain me, throw cuffs on me, and when I tell you you're wrong, your response is just, 'Oh, well?'" The lead officer straightened his stance. "We're investigating a crime. If you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." David's patience snapped. "You didn't investigate a damn thing. You saw me, you assumed, and you acted. That's not police work. That's profiling." Tension thickened in the air. A few passersby had stopped, watching the scene unfold. The officers exchanged glances, realizing the situation was spiraling. David took a step forward, the weight of his federal badge now undeniable. "I suggest," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "that you get those cuffs off me. Right now." The tension in the air was suffocating. A small crowd had gathered, watching as the scene unfolded. The officers stood firm, still gripping their weapons, but doubt flickered in their eyes. David Callaway had had enough. Moving slowly, he turned slightly, lifting his cuffed hands just enough to reach his back pocket. The officers tensed, but before they could react, he pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. "Here," he said coldly, flipping it open. The golden badge inside gleamed under the streetlights. Below it, his FBI identification card was as clear as day. Silence. The lead officer, the one who had been staring him down just seconds ago, suddenly looked away, his face draining of color. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the badge and their superior. David's voice was low and controlled, but each word hit like a hammer. "You just cuffed a federal agent, without cause, without reading me my rights, and without verifying my identity." He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "Tell me, officer, how do you think this is going to play out for you?" The senior officer, the only one who had shown any hesitation earlier, exhaled sharply. He turned to the lead cop. "Take the cuffs off." His voice was tight, barely concealing his anger. The lead officer hesitated, his hand twitching toward his belt. He swallowed hard, but still refused to meet David's gaze. The realization had finally hit him. They hadn't just harassed an innocent man. They had just detained an undercover FBI agent, and their careers might be over because of it. Not every agent was as fortunate as David Callaway. ATF agent James Burke had been in law enforcement for nearly a decade, working countless firearm cases, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened the day he arrived at a suburban home for an official firearm confiscation order. The suspect, Walter Higgins, had a long history of illegal firearm modifications. After a federal investigation, Higgins was flagged for illegally possessing and altering multiple weapons, making him a high-risk individual. Burke's job was simple: secure the firearms and ensure compliance with the law. But the moment Burke knocked on the door, he could tell something was off. Higgins cracked the door open just an inch, eyes darting nervously. "What do you want?" Burke remained professional, holding up his badge. "ATF, we have an official order to collect your firearms. We need you to step outside and cooperate." Higgins didn't step out. Instead, his grip on the door tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," Burke exhaled. He had seen this before, a man desperate to hold on to weapons he shouldn't have. "Sir, I need you to slam." Shut the door in his face. Burke sighed and reached for his radio, prepared to call backup. But before he could even press the button, red and blue lights flashed behind him. He turned to see a line of patrol cars skidding to a stop. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn. Burke froze. Then came the order that made his blood run cold. "Hands in the air. Get on the ground. Now!" Higgins had called the police on him. Police escalate the situation with excessive force. James Burke had been in dangerous situations before, but he never imagined that standing outside a suburban home in broad daylight would be one of them. Dozens of red dots from police tasers and firearms danced across his chest. The officers had their weapons drawn, their voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of commands. "Get on the ground! Now!" Burke, still holding his ATF badge in plain sight, took a cautious step forward. "I'm a federal agent. AF! This is a legal operation." But the officers weren't listening. One of them, a sergeant with an itchy trigger finger, stepped forward, his gun locked onto Burke's head. "I said, get on the ground!" Burke hesitated. This had to be a mistake. He was a federal officer. They should have been working together, not treating him like a suspect. He started to lower his hands, reaching slowly toward his badge. Big mistake. "He's going for a weapon," someone shouted. Burke barely had time to react before a hard knee slammed into his back, knocking him forward. His arms were yanked behind him, and before he could protest, a sharp burst of electricity ripped through his body. Taser. His muscles locked up, pain flooding every nerve as he collapsed onto the pavement. The officers piled on him, pressing his face into the rough asphalt, twisting his arms at unnatural angles. "Stop resisting," they barked, even though he wasn't resisting at all. Burke gasped for breath. He had been on the other side of takedowns like this, but now he understood how easily things could spiral out of control. He wasn't a criminal. But to these cops, he was just another threat. James Burke had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but nothing prepared him for this. His face was pressed against the rough asphalt, gravel digging into his skin as multiple officers pinned him down. His arms were twisted painfully behind his back, the cold bite of steel cuffs locking around his wrists. Every muscle in his body still seized from the taser shock, leaving him breathless and disoriented. "Check my ID," he gasped, his voice hoarse from the pain. "I'm ATF. I'm a federal agent." But the officers didn't care. "Shut up," one of them barked, shoving his knee deeper into Burke's spine. "You move, I'll light you up again." For over an hour, Burke sat cuffed in the back of a police cruiser, his wrists throbbing from the restraints. He watched helplessly as officers milled around, taking their time to verify his identity, something that should have taken seconds. When the truth finally came out, the shift in their demeanor was palpable. A lieutenant finally approached the car, his face tense. Agent Burke, we verified your credentials. There was a misunderstanding." Burke's blood boiled. A misunderstanding? They tased him, slammed him to the ground, ignored his badge, humiliated him. And now they wanted to brush it off? Due to severe back injuries and PTSD, Burke was removed from active duty, reassigned to administrative work. His career permanently altered because of one reckless mistake. But he wasn't going to let it slide. With the help of his lawyers, Burke filed a lawsuit against the Columbus Police Department, citing wrongful arrest, excessive force, and brutality. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding them accountable. Mac Proctor had always been a law-abiding citizen. As a delivery driver, he spent most of his days navigating the city streets, making sure packages arrived on time. But what most people didn't know about Mac was that he had a sharp mind for the law, a skill that would soon come in handy. One evening, after finishing his shift, he stopped at a convenience store. He parked in a legal spot, but when he returned to his car, a police officer was already standing beside it, arms crossed. "Sir, you're being detained for a parking violation," the officer said. Mac frowned but remained calm. "What violation?" The cop shrugged. "You're too close to the curb. License and registration." Mac sighed. He had seen this type of behavior before, officers looking for an excuse to escalate a minor issue into something bigger. He handed over his license but said nothing else. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Where are you coming from?" Mac remained silent. The officer crossed his arms. "Why are you acting suspicious?" Mac finally spoke, his tone measured. "Officer, am I legally required to answer your questions?" The cop's jaw clenched. "I'm just trying to have a conversation." Mac nodded, "and I'm exercising my right to remain silent." The officer's face twisted in frustration. He had been hoping for compliance, maybe even an argument, but instead Mac had outmaneuvered him legally. Realizing he had no grounds to escalate, the cop reluctantly handed back Mac's license and walked away. Mac drove off, shaking his head, knowing the law had just saved him from an unnecessary confrontation. Mac Proctor knew the game the officer was playing. It wasn't about the so-called parking violation. It was about control. Standing beside Mac's car, the officer still held on to his license and registration, refusing to return them. His eyes were locked onto Mac, waiting for any sign of nervousness, any excuse to escalate. But Mac wasn't nervous. He was prepared. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "you've checked my documents. Now please return them." The officer didn't move. "Just answer a few quick questions and you'll be on your way." Mac didn't budge. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I'm just conducting an investigation." "For what crime?" Mac pressed. Silence. The cop shifted his weight, clearly frustrated that his usual tactics weren't working. Mac leaned in slightly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "If I'm not being detained, you must return my license and let me go. Otherwise, you are unlawfully holding me." The officer's fingers tightened around Mac's license for a moment. Then, finally, with visible reluctance, he handed it back. "Watch your attitude," he muttered. Mac smirked. "Watch your abuse of authority." Without another word, he got into his car and drove off. The entire exchange had been nothing more than an officer's attempt to assert dominance. But Mac knew his rights, and that made all the difference. As he merged onto the highway, he shook his head. Too many people fell victim to unlawful detainments. Tonight, he wasn't one of them. For FBI agent David Callaway, his badge was his shield. The moment officers realized their mistake, they backed off, knowing they had just detained someone with the power to hold them accountable. His status granted him immediate immunity. But ATF agent James Burke wasn't as lucky. Despite being a federal agent, he was tased, thrown to the ground, and humiliated, all because local officers refused to listen. His credentials should have protected him, but ignorance and aggression overpowered logic. His case proves that even those in law enforcement aren't always safe from unlawful detainment. Then there was Mac Proctor, an everyday citizen with no badge, no federal authority, just knowledge. Unlike the other two, he had no official title to demand respect, yet he still walked away without escalation. Why? Because he understood his rights and refused to be manipulated. These stories paint a troubling but powerful picture. Legal knowledge isn't just for lawyers and officers, it's for everyone. Knowing when you are legally required to comply versus when an officer is overstepping their authority can be life-changing. Burke's tragedy could have been prevented. Callaway's situation should have never happened, and Mac's story proves that awareness can be a weapon against intimidation. In a world where power can be abused, knowledge is the strongest defense. These incidents shine a harsh light on systemic issues within law enforcement, from racial profiling to excessive force and a troubling lack of accountability. The contrast between the cases is staggering. When FBI agent David Callaway was detained, officers scrambled to fix their mistake the moment they realized who he was. He was quickly released, no further harm done. His status and badge protected him. But ATF agent James Burke wasn't granted the same respect. Despite also being a federal agent, officers tased and brutalized him before even verifying his identity. Why the difference? Was it lack of communication? A rush to judgment? Or something more troubling? Bias, unchecked aggression, and disregard for proper procedure? Then there's Mac Proctor, an average citizen with no law enforcement affiliation. Unlike Callaway, he had no badge to shield him. And unlike Burke, he wasn't subjected to violence. Instead, he used his knowledge of the law to navigate an officer's attempt to exert unnecessary control. What do these cases reveal? That law enforcement responses are inconsistent, often influenced by bias, assumptions, and power dynamics rather than clear legal standards. That officers sometimes act first and verify later, leaving innocent people to suffer the consequences. The takeaway? Knowing the law is the most powerful tool against wrongful arrests. Callaway's badge saved him. Burke's status didn't. Mac's legal awareness did. In a system where power can be misused, knowledge remains the only true defense. This story is more than just a series of personal events. It exposes a deep-rooted systemic issue in law enforcement: bias, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability in handling situations. The contrast in how the three main characters were treated is deeply thought-provoking. FBI agent David Callaway was immediately released the moment officers realized his identity, a privilege of power. Meanwhile, ATF agent James Burke, despite also being a federal officer, was brutalized, tased, and humiliated simply because police failed to verify his credentials before taking action. This raises an unsettling question. Why was Burke treated so much worse despite holding the same federal authority? Most striking is the case of Mac Proctor, an ordinary citizen with no badge, no official power, but knowledge of the law. Without special privileges, he successfully defended himself against an unnecessary escalation, simply because he knew his rights. Mac's story proves that in an imperfect system, legal knowledge can be the most crucial shield of protection. This story delivers an important lesson. Not everyone is treated fairly under law enforcement. Bias, rushed actions, and misuse of power can happen at any moment, and anyone can become a victim. However, understanding the law and knowing your rights can help prevent wrongful encounters and protect yourself from abuse of authority. In the end, justice is not always perfectly upheld, but sometimes we must fight to ensure it is.